my dinosaur mug here, because I'm actually 6 years old. Recently, I released some content on the internet talking about socialism, and y'all had some opinions. So I am going to go through some of those opinions. That phone was upside down. We're going to go through some of those comments in good faith and respond. Sounds appealing, but never works in theory. So right off the bat, this idea that socialism never works, right? Again, talking about democratic ownership of the means of production, that comes into question with the existence of things like co-ops, right? Cooperatives where everybody who's a part of the company owns part of that company, rather than having like this tyrannical CEO that lords over you and makes decisions on the company's behalf, or like a private board of directors. And there's lots of examples like this in the real world. One that leftists spring up all the time is the Mondragon Corporation. This is an example of a pretty successful cooperative. Usually, however, when people talk about socialism not working, what they're referring to is socialist countries failing, right? Countries like the USSR, that's the big one that everyone points to. And even if we're using this metric to say that socialism has never worked, it's just not true. Hi, it's me, in the future, in the editing process. There are a few different off-the-cuff examples that I gave when I initially recorded this response. And on further reflection, I don't think I articulated my position well enough. So this is an attempt to correct the record. When it comes to the question of socialist countries failing, a whole slew of arguments and talking points tend to emerge from several points of the political spectrum. There is a contentious debate among different leftists over whether or not Leninist projects like the USSR even count as truly being socialist. Many of these critiques cite how Marxist-Leninist projects of the past, with rare exception, dissolved workers' councils and instituted a vanguard party of professional revolutionaries. This was done with the goal of stabilizing socialist countries post-revolution and preventing reactionary elements from developing after the fact. However, in practice, these projects ended up recreating the same capitalist hierarchical structures that existed before, just with a can of red paint splashed over the top. This isn't to say that life in many of these countries wasn't genuinely made better by Marxist-Leninist governance, just that it didn't produce an actual socialist outcome. That is to say, a project where the workers owned and managed the means of production. In my opinion, at the end of the day, Marxism-Leninism turned out to be an effective model for liberating people from colonial oppression. And I believe that this is a major contributing factor to why Marxist-Leninist projects were so prevalent in the 20th century. That being said, I'm including examples of Marxist-Leninist projects in my response for this particular prompt, despite my deep ideological differences with Leninism as a whole. That's a topic for another time. All right, it's enough out of me from the future. Back to the video. An example that people often point to is Burkina Faso under Thomas Sankara. So Burkina Faso, a country in Africa, used to be a colony of France known as Upper Volta. The country wasn't food sufficient, literacy rates were low, there was female genital mutilation, so there were a lot of things present within Upper Volta that were really, really bad. And when Thomas Sankara took control and renamed the country Burkina Faso, he implemented a wide array of sweeping reforms that raised literacy rates, that planted trees, made the country food self-sufficient. Now, Sankara was eventually assassinated, but just within a few years, he was able to raise the standard of living in Burkina Faso and make it a fairly good place to live for the people there. Another example that's usually pointed to in the United States is Cuba. This is the closest quote-unquote communist country to our border. And if you look at the history of Cuba, Cuba was basically a colony to the United States in all but name in the first half of the 20th century after the Spanish-American War. Again, literacy rates were terrible, living conditions were terrible, the average lifespan was terrible for the average working person living in Cuba. After the Cuban Revolution, living standards went way up. Even now, as bad as things are, largely because of the embargo from the United States, living standards are high. The lifespan in Cuba is about the same as that in the United States. It's just a little lower, if I remember correctly. Now, I also have to mention that these countries that I've listed as examples here, I don't consider these personally an ideal society for the kind of socialist that I am, right? I'm more of a libertarian socialist. So the kinds of societies that I usually want to emulate tend to be things like the CNT-FAI, in revolutionary Catalonia, or the DAANES, what's commonly called Rojava, which exists today. And to add a further point to this idea that socialism never works, because of leftist labor organizing that happened for decades in the late 19th and early 20th century, we got things like antitrust laws. We eventually got the New Deal, right? Social Security, the weekend, child labor laws in general. In multiple ways, it just isn't true that socialism never works, right? Some of that might be small victories along the way. It might be socialist societies, socialist countries that have risen and fallen over the past 100 years. But I really do believe that as the world develops, right, we're either going to have to adopt some sort of socialist system or things are just going to fall apart. And that's because left unregulated, wealth is going to accumulate in fewer and fewer hands under capitalism until you just have an unlivable situation. We're getting dangerously close to that right now. It's harder and harder for the average working person, even in the United States, to live because of all the wealth that is hoarded by the richest people in the world. And we could talk about various solutions to that, right? There's social democracy, which I don't think goes far enough. There's anarchism, libertarian socialism, democratic socialism that's regulated through cybernetic technology, like what you saw with Project Cybersyn in Salvador Allende's Chile. You know, stuff like that. All right, I think I've made this point here. This commenter said, and people will always elect to not work, so the government becomes your boss and decides your labor. There's nothing democratic about it. I disagree with that, obviously. And later on, this same commenter says, it doesn't work for many reasons, including no way to determine prices or value. Just very not true. No way to get people to do certain jobs without incentives. Again, not true. No way to get people who don't want to work. Still a problem we have now. And more. All right, so let's break this down. So this idea that people will always elect to not work. I would phrase this differently. When you get hired by someone to do a particular job, right? Let's say you're working at a restaurant, right? Or you just got a job at like a marketing agency or something like that. There's a process you go through, right? You apply, you get selected for an interview, you go in an interview, and then if you get hired, there's a negotiation process, right? And that negotiation process involves what your salary is going to be, right? And when you think about what the incentives are between you and your boss, a contradiction becomes observable, right? Your boss, their sole goal for their company is to maximize their profits, right? They want to make more money. And your goal, if you're an employee, is to make enough money to live, right? You need money to live. So you naturally want to work the least amount possible while making the most amount you can, and your boss wants the opposite. Your boss wants to work you as much as they possibly can and yet pay you the least amount possible. And this is in order for them to maximize their profits. I don't think this is what that commenter was referring to, but this is a contradiction that exists now under capitalism. We have almost nothing but negative incentives to try and get us to work, right? If you don't get a job, you don't get health insurance. Your ability to get medical care is tied to your employment. All of these services and utilities that we have to pay money for in order to survive, we need to work a job in order to access, right? So that creates a very powerful incentive, right? It's basically just work or starve. And because of those negative incentives, most people find themselves, at least once at some point in their lives, in a situation where you're working a job you don't want to be working, and your time, your most valuable resource, is all being spent up working towards something that you don't really want to be doing just so you can survive. So living under a socialist system isn't about just living with no incentives to work at all, so much as it is removing the negative incentives and replacing them with positive incentives, right? If you have more democratic control over the kind of work you're going to be doing, no matter what the task is, even if it's, back-breaking labor, you're going to be at least a little more excited to do it if you have a say in how the process goes. We can create positive incentives for certain necessary jobs that have to be done, and we can have stronger social safety nets undergirding that entire structure so that people don't fall through the cracks and end up homeless. All of these goods and services that are subject to inelastic demand, right? Things that people need, housing, healthcare, food, we can publicly provide all of that to people and still have plenty of wealth to go around and to stimulate the economy. And lastly, the point here, which I find to be the most alarming, is no way to determine prices or values. Okay, so this is like Marxism 101 kind of stuff, right? So Marx adhered to a variant of the labor theory of value. Basically, when economics kind of became a field of study for people around the end of the 18th century, it's widely believed to have started with Adam Smith, people started trying to theorize how we value certain commodities, right? Because when markets started becoming more prominent, when capitalism started being adopted, you would see the price of goods and services fluctuate within that market, and people tried to figure out why that happens. And the basic idea behind this is that the value that we attribute to certain goods is correlated with the amount of labor that went into it, right? The labor costs. Marx took this idea from Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and he kind of updated it in his own way. And it's kind of the bedrock of all of Marxist thought, right? Is Marx's interpretation of the labor theory of value. So what this person is saying, I have to assume they've just never really looked into Marxist thought before, and they're just kind of spouting something that they heard a capitalist propagandist say. That sounds very harsh, but that's kind of the assumption that I'm left to make here. It's too late. You should have voted for Sanders years ago. You're ruined with Trump and his MAGA. You may well be right there. But number one, I think that nihilism isn't a solution. Electoral politics isn't the end-all be-all of this discussion. So much of American politics and American political thought centers around our electoral system, right? And I'm not saying don't go vote. I'm just saying you should be doing more than just voting every 2 or 4 years, right? You should be going out and getting involved with socialist orgs in your community. We need labor organizing. We need more unions, as kind of faulty as those can be nowadays. We need mutual aid organizations. We need direct outside pressure to the state in order to coerce it, as long as it exists, into giving people what they need. So things are bad right now. Don't get me wrong. We are in hell, okay? But what we need to do right now is not sequester ourselves into our little echo chambers and not tuck away and hide. We need to roll up our sleeves and get to work. Libs will never be ready for this conversation. Unfortunately, yeah. I think most people, especially in like Western liberal democracies who become leftists, will tell you that they had to have their faith utterly broken in the system in order to adopt what became their worldview, right? And this was the case with me. For me, my identity as a socialist is still kind of a new thing. And the thing that really pushed me over the edge was the way that the United States handled the COVID-19 pandemic. But that was after years and years of seeing how the government under a Democratic administration, under Obama, bailed out Wall Street after the subprime mortgage crisis, after the Great Recession. This was after seeing how, for most of my life, my country put us illegally into a forever war in the Middle East. It took many years of me gradually learning before I was pushed over that edge. I had to lose faith. I had to be violently shaken awake. So as irritating as it is sometimes to have a world full of liberals who just aren't getting it, I think we need to still entertain this conversation at every possible juncture, because we need to show that there's a viable alternative. Leftism is a barbarism in a dress. Okay. Fascism, lol. Okay, here we go. So this person is referencing the point in the video where I said this: we need a populist counter-narrative to Trump's fascism. And yeah, Donald Trump is a fascist. I don't really see how that's debatable, but we're gonna talk about it. So when I say fascist, I don't mean fascist in the sense of anybody I don't like is a fascist. I do agree that word tends to get thrown around quite a bit to the point where it doesn't carry the same weight that it should. And even Donald Trump himself has used this term in this way.
This is communist, this is Marxist, this is fascist. This is a radical left Marxist, communist, fascist. These far left fascists, led by Harris and her group.
However, when I talk about fascism, what I'm referring to is the actual, historical understanding of what fascism is. And I think the most concise definition comes from the scholar Roger Griffin. That's the one.
We can debate that later, preferably when we're drunk.
His definition of fascism was palingenetic ultranationalism. That sounds like a mouthful, but what it means is not just nationalism, like pride in one's country, but ultranationalism, like kind of this hyperfixation on your country being the best, combined with the palingenetic aspect. This term refers to the desire to go back to some mythic past, right? The desire to return to some former glory. So the best example of this in the current day is Make America Great Again, right? When was America great? It's kind of a nebulous thing. And something that's often paired with this desire to return to a mythic past is this idea that certain groups of people made things worse, and that's why we're in the situation we are now. That's why MAGA kind of goes hand in hand with white nationalism and racism and xenophobia. That's why an immigration crackdown is a huge part of Donald Trump's agenda.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there.
However, I think the best kind of comprehensive breakdown of fascism and fascist thought comes from an essay written by Umberto Eco, who was he was an Italian scholar. He actually lived through the rise of Mussolini. So what I'm referring to is his essay, Fascism. I'm gonna pull it up here. This essay breaks down 14 characteristics of fascist governments. And just for the sake of brevity, because this isn't the overall topic of this video, I'm not gonna be breaking this down at length, but I am gonna do two things. I'm gonna link the essay in the description below, and I'm gonna recommend y'all check out a video by the channel Anarch, which breaks down the 14 points and the way that Donald Trump and his administration adhere to each of the 14 points as listed by Umberto Eco. So go check those out. All right, moving on. Believing in politics at all is laughable. Okay, that's a political statement. Everything is political. I will maintain this. Art is political, life is political, politics is our relationship. It's the relationship between people. I mean, this is just nihilism. This is cynicism. And yeah, let's not do that. I know things are bad, but let's not do that. So this commenter says, yes, move further left so you can make the center more right. Y'all know that the more left you go, the more people on the left you lose, right? And in parentheses, goes for either party. And then they show a graphic from a study. We need to go through two things here. Number one, this study does not say what this commenter is implying. So we're gonna go through what the study actually says and talk about its findings. The second thing I want to discuss is the critique that the commenter himself is making, because though the study isn't saying what he thinks it says, the commenter himself is kind of levying a particular critique at the point that I was making. And so I want to address that separately. So first, let's get into the study itself. So the study that this commenter sent to me was called Attitude Networks as Intergroup Realities, using network modeling to research attitude identity relationships in polarized political contexts. Okay, so basically what this study is trying to demonstrate is that our attitudes about particular issues correlate strongly with a certain identity. And this sort of in-group, out-group network is formed around that. All right, so That's more words. So this is an excerpt from the introduction to the publication. So, on a theoretical level, the results corroborate the idea that multiple attitudes are organized and represented in the form of socially meaningful belief systems that can be depicted as networks. And this is specifically what was pictured in the graphic that this user shared with me. In the specific context of the American political divide between Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, there are certain key issues, right? Abortion rights, gun control, women's rights, stuff like that, that can be correlated with a particular group identity. It's more about how we can accurately predict in-groups and out-groups based on political opinions. And these are things that I think we all kind of intuitively know, but what this particular publication does is it gives an actual, testable model to demonstrate that. So let's get into the participants. On a categorical scale, 58.1% self-identified as Democrats, 28% as independents, and 13.9% as Republicans. So right off the bat, we need to acknowledge that we had a very Democrat-heavy pool of participants. They had a range of strongly agree to strongly disagree, and each question was loaded in such a way to where strong disagreement got you in the liberal camp, the Democrat camp, and agreement got you in the conservative camp. So abortion should be illegal, strongly agree, that's a conservative position. Strongly disagree, that is the standard progressive position. So given all of that information, it makes perfect sense that the results that you see in this graphic look the way that they do. This isn't a representation of left versus right. And don't get me wrong, this is a valuable publication to read and to absorb, because I think it demonstrates something we all kind of intuitively recognize, which is how we emotionally form identities and in-groups and out-groups, and we might not really examine our beliefs all that much outside of where they fall within that group. And that's something we should all be careful of, right? To the second point I want to make about this particular comment. First off, the thing that needs to be made clear here is, as a socialist, I don't fall on this spectrum that's represented in this study. And while most socialists out there share the same progressive values that Democrats do, we are not Democrats. I am not a Democrat. And again, this whole idea of the further left we move, the more people we lose, I think the thing that needs to be double-clicked on here is there's this idea, I don't know if it's a uniquely American idea, it's at least a very liberal idea, that the centrists are the ones who are kind of enlightened. They have things figured out. They don't take political extremes. But in my opinion, centrism is really just only a useful tool for conservatism. And I'll explain what I mean here. When you think about the traditional left-right divide, the people on the left are the progressives, right? And being progressive entails that something about the way society is currently structured is unsatisfactory in your view, and so you seek to work to improve that, right? You want to change something about it. You want to introduce something new. Conservatism is the opposite of that. Conservatism exists in reaction to that. Conservatism believes that something about the present or the past is desirable, that we have to retreat to that. And in this sense, centrism only really serves the interests of conservatives, because conservatism is the default position, right? Conservatism is the position that starts where we are now. It doesn't do us any good to have a hodgepodge of galaxy-brained ideas about how the world should be and not take any action on it. Whew, boy howdy. I'm tired of talking, people. All right, I think that about does it for this one. If you found this interesting, please like this video and subscribe. If you didn't like it, feel free to dislike it. Feel free to leave an angry comment. The previously mentioned essays and videos and studies will be linked in the description below. You can go check that out now. Thanks for watching.